The soup was still warm. That was the thing that broke Nora Bell wide open, the thing that cracked her chest like dry timber split by a wedge. She stood in the doorway of her small adobe house on the eastern edge of Redemption, Texas, the year 1882 pressing down on her shoulders like a stone, and she stared at the tin pot sitting on her weathered wooden step. Steam curled off it in the cold morning air, thin and pale as a ghost, and the smell of it reached her even before she knelt down. Beef broth. Onion, something that might have been sage. It was the third morning. She had not opened the door on the first morning. She had pressed herself against the inside wall, heart hammering, listening to the sound of boots on her step, and then the quiet, careful withdrawal of them, the creak of someone moving away without demanding anything, without calling out, without making her feel the way men in this town usually made her feel. Threatened, cornered, owed. She had not opened the door on the second morning either. She had watched through the narrow crack between the window shutter and the sill, and she had seen him. David Wilcox. Broad-shouldered and lean, his dark hat pulled low against the January wind, setting the pot down with two hands like he was placing something precious. He had not knocked. He had not waited. He had simply left it there and walked back toward the main road, his coat open despite the cold, his stride unhurried and certain, the stride of a man who expected nothing in return. And that terrified her more than anything else, because Nora Bell had learned the hard way, in the most permanent and devastating way a woman could learn something, that men who seemed to expect nothing were often the ones collecting the largest debts in secret. She had a scar that proved it. Not on her skin, but in a place far harder to heal. Now it was the third morning, and the soup was warm, and she could feel every single one of the months she had spent in this town alone rising up inside her like floodwater. 7 months of shuttered windows and early mornings and careful avoidance, and the particular loneliness of a woman who had decided that survival required isolation. 7 months since she had arrived in Redemption with $43, a carpet bag, a bruised jaw that was nearly faded, and a name that belonged to her again because she had taken it back. Her maiden name. Bell, not the other name. Never again the other name. She picked up the pot. It was heavy and real and warm against her palms, and she stood there in the doorway holding it, and for the first time in a very long time Nora Bell cried. Not from sadness exactly, though sadness was part of it. She cried because someone had thought she might be hungry. Someone had thought she might be cold. Someone had come back 3 days in a row not to take anything from her but to leave something, and the sheer impossible gentleness of that simple act was more than her carefully constructed walls could hold. She looked up and down the road. David Wilcox was already gone. She stepped back inside, closed the door, and began to eat. And while she ate the soup, which was better than anything she had made for herself in months, she started thinking about how she had ended up in Redemption at all, and how David Wilcox had come to know she needed feeding, and how a story that had started in fire and betrayal had somehow led her to a warm step in a cold West Texas morning. It had started, as so many disasters do, with a man who smiled too easily. His name had been Carter Voss, and he had arrived in the small Colorado mining town of Glenwood Springs in the spring of 1880, with a horse that cost more than most men earned in 6 months, and a manner that suggested he was doing the world a favor by existing in it. Nora had been 24 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died the previous winter and left her the schoolhouse contract and exactly nothing else. She was teaching 12 children in a one-room building that leaked when it rained, and she was proud of it, and she was managing, which was more than most people expected of a woman alone. Carter Voss had walked into that schoolroom on a Tuesday afternoon to ask directions to the mining office and had stayed to talk for 45 minutes, and by the end of those 45 minutes Nora had felt, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely seen. He had asked about her curriculum. He had admired the way she organized her bookshelves. He had laughed at something she said, a real laugh, and he had looked at her like she was remarkable rather than merely tolerable. She should have been more suspicious of a man who was that good at making a woman feel remarkable. They were married 6 months later. It was fast, and her friend Louise had said so, and Nora had pressed Louise's hand and smiled and said that when something was right you simply knew it. She had believed that completely. She had built her entire new life on it. The first year was not terrible. That was the thing about Carter Voss that made the eventual horror so complete. He was not monstrous from the beginning. He was charming and generous and occasionally breathtaking in his affection. He brought her flowers. He told her stories. He had opinions about books and shared them, and sometimes those opinions were even interesting. The warning signs were small and easy to reframe as eccentricities. He did not like her spending time with Louise. He had strong feelings about where she should and should not go without him. He sometimes said things that were not quite cruel but were not quite kind, and then laughed and called her oversensitive when she flinched. By the second year, Nora had stopped seeing Louise entirely. By the third year, she had stopped leaving the house without his permission. By the fourth year, she understood that the man she had married was not the man who had walked into her schoolroom asking for directions. That man had been a performance, carefully calibrated and expertly delivered, and the real Carter Voss was something else entirely. He was a man with a dark past he had never disclosed, a man who had left 2 previous lives behind him in 2 other towns, a man who owed money to people who collected debts in ways that left marks. He had married Nora partly because she was pretty and partly because a respectable wife made him look legitimate. And when his schemes in Glenwood Springs began to unravel, he had turned the full weight of his frustration and his fear toward her, which is what men like Carter Voss always did when the world stopped cooperating. The night she finally left, she had a bruised jaw, a torn dress, and the absolute cold certainty that if she stayed she would not survive another year. She had packed her carpetbag in the 4 minutes between when Carter passed out drunk on the parlor floor, and when he might wake up. She had taken her $43 from the loose floorboard under the kitchen table where she had been hiding it for 8 months, one small coin at a time, because she had known for 8 months that she would need to run, and she had been building the means to do it the way you build anything under someone's watchful eye. Slowly, secretly, with enormous patience and constant fear. She had walked out of Glenwood Springs in the dark, caught the pre-dawn freight wagon to Pueblo, and from Pueblo taken the train south and then west, buying the cheapest tickets to the furthest destination her money could reach, which turned out to be a small stop in West Texas called Redemption, a name that had struck her as either deeply appropriate or deeply ironic, and she had not yet decided which. Redemption in 1881 was a town of approximately 400 people, a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as a courtroom, a livery stable, a small hotel, and a handful of businesses that came and went depending on the season. It sat at the edge of the Chihuahuan Desert, sun-blasted in summer and windswept in winter, the kind of place that required a certain stubbornness to endure. The surrounding ranches provided its economy. The railroad had not yet come through, which kept it from growing into something larger. It was, in short, the kind of place a woman could disappear into if she needed to. Nora rented the small adobe house on the eastern edge of town from a widow named Mrs. Calloway who charged reasonable rates and asked almost no questions, which Nora appreciated enormously. She had taken in sewing work almost immediately because her hands knew the skill from years of making do, and within a month she had enough steady clients that she could eat and keep warm and begin the slow, careful work of rebuilding herself. She did not make friends. Not deliberately unkindly, but because friendship required trust and trust required openness and openness felt like exposure, and exposure felt like danger. She was polite to everyone. She smiled at the appropriate moments. She bought her goods from the general store owned by a man named Harper and paid on time and caused no trouble. She was, to all appearances, simply a quiet widow woman doing her work and keeping herself to herself. She told people she was a widow because it was simpler than the truth, and because in 1882 a woman who had left her husband was regarded with a particular mixture of suspicion and judgment that Nora did not have the energy to navigate. A widow got sympathy. A woman who had run got questions. She had answered enough questions in her life. David Wilcox had come to redemption 8 months before Nora arrived, which meant he had been there about 15 months total by the time the soup incident occurred. He ran the livery stable, having bought it from the previous owner at a fair price, and he was regarded around town as quiet, reliable, and fair. He was 31 years old, which was 5 years older than Nora's 26, and he had the kind of face that was not immediately striking, but became more interesting the longer you looked at it. Strong jaw, dark eyes that had a quality of steadiness, like deep water rather than shallow. Hands that were always doing something, always occupied with the practical work of keeping animals healthy and tack in good repair. He had a dark past of his own, though it was a different kind of dark from Carter Voss's. David Wilcox had fought in a part of the Texas frontier conflicts that he did not talk about at the saloon, but that kept him awake sometimes. The particular insomnia of a man who has seen things that cannot be unseen and done things that cannot be undone. He had served as a scout for the U.S. Army during a period when the Army's actions against the Comanche and Kiowa were characterized by the kind of official violence that was ordered from above and carried out by the men at the bottom, who were not given the luxury of refusal. David had eventually refused anyway, at a cost that had included his commission and nearly his freedom, and he had spent the years since moving through the West in search of something he could not quite name, a place where he could do honest work and have it be enough. A way to live with what he carried. Redemption was the closest he had come to finding that. He had not been looking for a woman when Nora Bell arrived in town. He was not, as a rule, looking for much of anything beyond the next day's honest labor, but he noticed her in the way you notice something that does not quite fit its surroundings. She moved through redemption like a woman who was always listening for danger, head slightly tilted, steps placed with the careful precision of someone who had learned that drawing attention could be costly. He recognized that quality of watchfulness. He had worn it himself. He had not tried to introduce himself. He had not manufactured reasons to cross her path, or sent anyone to speak on his behalf, or done any of the things a man in a small western town might do when a woman caught his interest. He simply noticed her, and then, over several months, he learned things about her the way you learn things in a small town without seeking the information, through proximity, through the ordinary commerce of community, through fragments of overheard conversation and small observed details. He learned that she lived alone. He learned that she was a seamstress. He learned that she was not, in fact, a widow, because Mrs. Calloway had mentioned to someone that Nora's husband was still alive in Colorado, which was not the kind of information that stayed contained in a town of 400 people. He learned that she rarely lit her lamp after dark and almost never opened her windows, and these things told him something about what kind of life she was recovering from, and it made him careful and it made him angry, though the anger was the cold, controlled kind rather than the hot, explosive kind, and he kept it where it could not touch her. The soup had started because of January. The winter of 1882 arrived in West Texas with unusual severity, a hard freeze that came down from the north in the first week of the new year, and settled in with the kind of stubborn persistence that killed livestock and froze water barrels, and made the ordinary work of staying warm into a significant undertaking. David had spent a full day reinforcing the livery stable against the wind and making sure his horses and the boarded animals were properly sheltered, and on his way home in the early dark, he had passed the eastern edge of town and noticed that the adobe house had no light in the window and no smoke from the chimney. That was unusual. Even a woman who kept to herself needed a fire in that cold. He had not been certain what to do about it. He was not a man who assumed his presence was wanted, and he had no particular right to knock on Nora Bell's door. But the temperature was dropping fast, and the wind was finding gaps in every building in town, and he found himself standing in the road outside her house for a long moment, looking at the dark window and the cold chimney, turning the situation over in his mind. He had gone home and made soup. He had had a pot of beef bones simmering all day already, the practical habit of a man who knew how to make a little go a long way, and he had added what vegetables he had and let it reduce into something real and warming. He had carried it to her step in the dark, set it there carefully, and walked away. He had not knocked because he had considered what it would feel like to a woman alone in the dark, in a cold house, to have a man knock on her door in the night. The soup without the confrontation seemed more honest about what he was actually offering, which was warmth without obligation, sustenance without strings. He could have been wrong about the whole thing. She might have been simply visiting someone and left her fire deliberately banked. She might have had reasons he could not imagine. But if he was wrong, the worst consequence was a pot of soup left uncollected, and he could live with that. He came back the second morning because she had not come to collect it. He found it still on the step, cooling, and he took it back and replaced it with a fresh pot and left again without waiting. The fact that she had not collected it did not tell him nothing was wrong. It might mean she was fine. It might mean she was too proud. It might mean she was too frightened. He left the fresh soup and let her decide. The third morning he came in the early light before the town was fully awake and set down a pot that had taken him considerable care. Good broth, sage from the small kitchen garden he kept behind the livery, a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth set beside it. He had stood for one moment on her step and he had heard something, a movement inside, a breath, the particular quality of a silence that was inhabited rather than empty. He had turned and walked away, and she had opened the door. Nora finished the soup slowly, letting the warmth of it spread through her from the center outward, and she sat at her small kitchen table and looked at the walls of her house and thought about who David Wilcox was and what it meant that he had come 3 days running and never once knocked or called or demanded to be acknowledged. She had watched him enough in her careful sideways way to have assembled a picture of him. She knew he was the livery man. She knew people in town seemed to genuinely like him, which was different from fearing him or humoring him, the two responses she had learned to distinguish from genuine affection. She had once seen him spend an entire afternoon working on a horse that belonged to a Mexican family who probably could not pay his full rate, and she had watched the care in his hands and the patience in his posture, and filed it away in the part of her mind that was always taking notes on men. She had also noticed, with the particular perception of a woman who had survived by reading signals, that he never looked at her in the calculating way, the way that asked what use she might be, the way that assessed her and found her worth something specific. When she caught his eye in the street, and she had, he looked at her the way you might look at someone you were worried about. Directly but not aggressively, concerned but not controlling, and then he would look away because he was not a man who stared. She had categorized him as potentially trustworthy and then immediately distrusted the categorization because Carter Voss had appeared potentially trustworthy for an entire year before the truth became undeniable. But the soup was real, and he had come 3 days. She made a decision. Not a large decision, not a declaration, not an opening of floodgates. A small, measured, carefully hedged decision. She would thank him. She would do it in daylight, in a public place, briefly and formally, and she would watch his face when she did it and she would see what she saw. And if what she saw was the thing she feared, the flicker of satisfaction that comes from a calculated move paying off, then she would know and she would retreat further and faster. But she would go. She washed her face. She changed her dress. She put on her coat, the good one she kept for town errands, dark wool, buttons all present and properly attached. She braided her dark hair and pinned it and looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. The woman who looked back at her had tired eyes and a determined jaw and the particular expression of someone doing something that frightened them, because it was the right thing to do. The livery stable was at the west end of the main street, past the general store and the church and the small post office. Nora walked the length of Redemption's main thoroughfare at mid-morning, when the street held enough people that she felt less exposed. The January wind had eased slightly, but the cold persisted, her breath coming in small clouds. She nodded to Mrs. Harper outside the store. She passed the blacksmith's without stopping. She reached the livery stable. The large doors were open to the cold winter light, and she could hear activity inside. The sound of a horse moving in its stall, the clink of metal. She stopped in the doorway, and her eyes adjusted to the dimmer interior, and she saw David Wilcox at the far end of the stable, bent over the hind foot of a bay mare, examining the shoe. He had not heard her come in over the sound of the animal. She watched him for a moment. His hands were steady. His manner with the horse was the same she had observed before, patient and matter-of-fact and entirely untheatrical. He talked quietly to the mare while he worked, not words she could make out from the doorway, just the low murmur of reassurance. The horse stood calm. "Mr. Wilcox," she said. He looked up. His face showed surprise, quickly controlled, and then something more careful. He set down the horse's foot gently and straightened and turned to face her, and she watched his expression with every ounce of the trained attentiveness she had developed over years of needing to read a room correctly in order to navigate it safely. What she saw was not triumph. It was not the satisfaction of a trap closing. It was something closer to relief, actually, which surprised her so much that she nearly took a step backward. "Miss Bell," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered from the few exchanges they had had in town, measured and quiet, the kind of voice that did not carry further than it needed to. "I came to thank you," she said. She had rehearsed this part. She kept her voice level and polite and her body angled toward the door. "For the soup. It was very kind. I wanted you to know it was appreciated." He nodded once. "I'm glad," he said. "I wasn't sure whether to stop after the first day." That was an interesting thing to say because it implied he had thought about it, considered stopping, decided to continue not because he expected reward but because he was still uncertain whether it was actually needed. She filed this away. "What made you think to start?" she asked. She had not planned this question. It came out on its own, pushed by genuine curiosity. He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not answer immediately, did not have a smooth, prepared response waiting. He thought about it genuinely, and then he said, "Saw no smoke from your chimney 2 nights running in that cold. Figured there was either no one home or someone who needed a fire lit." "I had a fire," she said, which was technically true, a very small one. "I know," he said. "I knew that by the second morning, still came." This created a silence between them that was not uncomfortable, but was full of things neither of them was going to say yet. She looked at him. He looked at her without looking away but without pressing either, and she thought again about the quality she had noted before, the stillness of him, the absence of that particular hunger she had learned to recognize, the hunger that wore the face of affection but was actually something much more possessive. "Well," she said, "thank you, that's all I came to say." "You're welcome," he said. "Miss Bell." She turned to go. "There's a community supper at the church Saturday evening," he said. She stopped. "Not suggesting you attend with me, just mentioning it's there." She turned back. He was looking at the mare again, adjusting something with the bridle. He was, she realized, giving her something to walk toward on her own terms rather than with him, which was a different thing entirely. "I'll think about it," she said. She walked back through Redemption's main street, and she was aware of a slight looseness in her chest that she did not quite know what to call. It was not happiness exactly. It was something more cautious than happiness. It was the first tiny crack of light under a door that had been shut for a very long time. She did go to the community supper on Saturday. She arrived late and stood near the back and ate the food that the church women had arranged on long tables, venison stew and cornbread, and a dried apple pie that was better than she expected. The church was full and warm, crowded with the families and single men and older women who formed the backbone of a small western town's social life. The noise of it was almost overwhelming after months of quiet, but she stayed. She made herself stay. David Wilcox was there. He was sitting with a group of men near the far wall, ranch hands and the blacksmith, and the man who ran the post office. She caught his eye once across the room, and he nodded briefly and then returned to his conversation, and he did not come over to speak to her, did not make any move to claim the gesture of her presence as a response to his suggestion. She stood with her plate and ate her supper and spoke briefly to Mrs. Calloway, her landlady, and to a woman named Sarah, whose daughter was the right age for schooling. And then something happened that Nora had not anticipated. A man came through the door. He was not from Redemption. She could tell that immediately from the way people reacted to him, the slight shift of attention that a stranger always provoked in a small town. He was perhaps 40, thickly built, with a cowhide coat and a hat that was expensive. He spoke to Harper, the store owner, near the door, and something about the way Harper's shoulders lifted and then deliberately relaxed told Nora that this man was not entirely welcome. She did not know why she looked at David Wilcox at that moment. She simply did. And she saw that he had also registered the stranger's arrival, and that the expression on his face was entirely different from the careful neutrality he wore in most of his interactions. There was recognition in it, and with the recognition, something that she would have called controlled alarm. The stranger's name turned out to be Raymond Cole, and by the end of the evening, through the ordinary currents of conversation in a small room, Nora had assembled enough of the picture to understand that Raymond Cole was a man with whom David Wilcox had some kind of shared history, the specific nature of which was not public knowledge, but which was clearly not benign. She went home with a new set of questions in her mind. Over the following week, without quite meaning to and without directly asking David anything, she learned more. Raymond Cole was in the cattle business, the kind of cattle business that sat in the gray area between legitimate ranching and organized theft. He had operated for several years in the region between West Texas and New Mexico, and he had a reputation among those who knew him for being the kind of man who found leverage on people and used it. He had arrived in Redemption not entirely at random. He was looking at land, or he was looking at something else. The two stories that circulated were not entirely compatible, and Nora, who had spent years learning to track the discrepancies between what people said and what they meant, found the discrepancy interesting. She did not learn the part about David until she heard it from Mrs. Calloway, who had it from Mrs. Harper, who had it from her husband, who had heard it from one of the men who had been sitting with David at the community supper, who had heard David say it himself to Raymond Cole in a brief and very quiet exchange that had taken place outside the church door at the end of the evening. What David had apparently said, very quietly and without raising his voice, was, "Whatever you came here for, Cole, it doesn't involve the people in this town. If you want to settle our business, you come to me." And what Raymond Cole had apparently said back was, "Your business is always other people's business, Wilcox. That's your problem." Nora turned this exchange over in her mind for several days. She was learning things that complicated her careful, limited picture of David Wilcox. He had a history with a dangerous man. He had a past that was not entirely clean. He had secrets. These facts, which would have been reason enough for her to close back down entirely and retreat to the safety of her shuttered house and her sewing work, did something unexpected to her instead. They made her want to understand rather than simply flee. They made her curious about what a man who had done things he was not proud of looked like when he was trying to do better. She recognized that trying, because she was doing it herself. She did something she had not done since arriving in Redemption. She knocked on a door that was not her own. She went to the livery stable on a Tuesday morning when the street was quiet and knocked on the side door and waited, and David came to the door with a look of careful surprise, and she said, "I wonder if you'd like to take a walk." He said yes. They walked along the road east of town, the one that led out into the desert scrub, the mesquite and lechugia standing against the pale sky. The cold had eased somewhat, a slight moderation that made the air brisk rather than brutal. They walked without talking for a while, which suited them both. She said, "Tell me about Raymond Cole." He walked 2 more steps before answering. "What have you heard?" "Enough to know he frightens you," she said. "Which means he should probably frighten me, and I've had enough things in my life that I wasn't warned about." He stopped walking. She stopped too, and they stood facing each other in the road with the desert wind moving through the brush around them. And she saw the thing in his face that she had been waiting to see, the thing that would tell her who he actually was. He could have deflected. He could have been smooth and reassuring in the way that false men were smooth and reassuring. He could have told her not to worry. Instead, he told her the truth. He told her about the army, about the period of frontier conflict he had participated in, and the specific incident that had ended his participation. He told it plainly, without excusing himself entirely and without performing excessive guilt, and she appreciated both the plainness and the lack of performance. He said he had done things he was not proud of, and that he carried them. He said he had eventually refused an order that required the killing of people who were in no way a military threat, that this refusal had cost him his rank and nearly his freedom, and that Raymond Cole had been present during those events as a civilian contractor who had profited from them, and that Cole regarded David's refusal as a personal betrayal that had complicated his business arrangements. "He blames me for a contract that fell through," David said. "There's money he says he's owed from that period. I know things about him that he would rather not be known. It's a standoff that's lasted several years." "Why is he here now?" she asked. "I don't know yet," David said. "That concerns me." She looked at him for a long moment. The desert light was bright and honest, the kind of light that did not allow for shadow. She said, "Thank you for telling me that." "You asked straight," he said. "Seemed right to answer straight." That was the day she recognized later when something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with any particular declaration, but the way weather shifts, the way the light quality changes before a storm, a difference in the air that you register with your whole body before your mind catches up. They began to talk. Not every day, and not at great length, but with increasing frequency, and with the particular intimacy of 2 people who were learning that the other person could be trusted with small truths, which was how you eventually built toward the large ones. She told him about her sewing work. He told her about a difficult horse he was working with, a young stallion with a fear response that required extraordinary patience. She told him about the school she had once run in Colorado, and something about the way his face opened when she described it. The genuine interest in his expression made her chest hurt in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. He told her about the kitchen garden behind the livery stable, the small practical satisfaction of growing sage and rosemary in the desert soil. She did not tell him about Carter yet. She was not ready for that. But she told him small pieces of what it had cost her to come to redemption, wrapped in language that was indirect but true, and he listened without asking questions that would push her further than she wanted to go. He received what she offered and did not demand more, and this was, she was beginning to understand, the fundamental quality that made him different from what she feared. Raymond Cole remained in town. He had taken a room at the hotel and was, as far as anyone could tell, conducting business. He had meetings with a couple of the larger ranch owners in the area, which suggested that his presence was indeed related to land or cattle or both. He was not overtly threatening. He was, in the way of men who operated through leverage and implication rather than direct confrontation, simply present in a way that generated discomfort. David did not avoid him. That was one of the things Nora noted. He did not change his routine or take different routes through town, or in any way perform the behavior of a man who was hiding. He went about his work, he was courteous when their paths crossed, and he watched Cole with the steady, patient attention of someone who knew that the important moment had not arrived yet. Cole spoke to Nora once. It happened at the general store on a Friday afternoon in late January, when she was there to purchase thread, and he was there to purchase something she did not pay attention to, because she was very immediately focused on the quality of his attention to her. He knew her name. She did not know how he knew her name. He said, "Miss Bell, isn't it? I understand you're a friend of David Wilcox's," she said. "I'm acquainted with him." Cole had a smile that reminded her of Carter Voss, which was the most frightening thing about him. The smoothness of it, the confidence behind it. He said, "He's an interesting man, not always honest about his history." "I couldn't say," Nora said. She paid for her thread. She left. She went directly to the livery stable. David was in the back, and she walked straight to him and said, "Cole spoke to me today. He knows my name. He mentioned your history." David's expression shifted in a way that told her this was not good news. "What did he say specifically?" She told him exactly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He's looking for leverage. He'll try to use you to put pressure on me, or he'll try to put doubt between us." "What kind of leverage?" she asked. "He may have information about where I've been and what I've done that he thinks would make you trust me less," David said. "Or he may try to find out information about you to use on me." That last sentence landed like a stone in still water. She looked at David Wilcox and thought about what Raymond Cole finding out about Carter Voss might mean. And she felt the particular cold fear that came with understanding that her hidden past was actually a vulnerability that could be weaponized against her. "There are things about my past," she said carefully, "that I haven't told you." "I know," he said, "just that. Not a demand." She made a decision right there in the livery stable, standing among the smell of hay and horses and saddle leather with the winter light coming through the high windows, that she was going to trust this man with the truth. Not because she was required to, not because she had been maneuvered into it, but because she was choosing to, and choosing to trust someone after everything she had survived was the bravest and most deliberate act she could imagine. She told him about Carter Voss. She told him all of it. The courtship, the marriage, the slow erosion of the first year, the complete containment of the second, the fear and the isolation and the bruised jaw and the $43 under the floorboard, and the 4-minute window between Carter's collapse and possible waking. She told it with the flat, precise clarity of someone who had thought about it so many times that the narrative had been stripped down to its essential bones. When she finished, David was very still. He did not say he was sorry in the weak, reflexive way that people said it when they did not know what else to offer. He did not immediately try to find solutions or suggest courses of action. He sat with what she had told him for a moment genuinely, and then he said, "Where is he now?" "Glenwood Springs, last I knew. I've been here 7 months. He hasn't found me as far as I can tell." She paused. "I'm not entirely certain he's looked." "That uncertainty is its own kind of weight," David said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right." They were quiet together for a while after that. Outside, the wind moved through the mesquite, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and redemption went about its ordinary business all around them. And in the interior of the livery stable, something that had been fragile and tentative became slightly more solid. He said, "I'm not going to pretend what you've told me doesn't make me angry, but the anger isn't yours to manage. I'll keep it where it belongs," she said. "Carter also said things that sounded protective. In the beginning." He looked at her directly. "I know," he said. "That's why it's going to matter more what I do than what I say." He was right, and she knew he was right, and the fact that he understood the distinction without her having to explain it was worth more to her in that moment than any declaration he might have made. Raymond Cole made his move the following week. It came in the form of a letter, delivered to David's address at the livery stable, containing a fairly direct statement of what Cole wanted. He was purchasing land in the area, he wrote, and he needed certain arrangements to go smoothly, and David was in a position to either facilitate or complicate those arrangements. Cole had, apparently, been doing more than simply looking at land. He had been gathering information, and the information he had gathered about David's past could be presented to the Army's legal authorities in a way that would create significant problems for David. regardless of whether David had eventually done the right thing. The army, Cole suggested, did not always distinguish clearly between the men who carried out orders and the men who eventually refused them. Both could be blamed. Cole required a written statement from David confirming certain events in a way that would serve Cole's interests. In exchange, the information would remain private. It was, in its essential structure, blackmail. David showed Nora the letter. She read it carefully twice, and then she set it down on the workbench between them and she said, "He doesn't know you've already told me about your history." "No," David said, "which means the leverage he's trying to create doesn't exist," she said. "Not with me." He looked at her. "That matters to you. It matters because he thinks isolating you will work," she said. "It won't. I'm not going anywhere." The quiet that followed was different from previous quiets between them. It was warmer. It was full of something she had not quite let herself feel yet, something she had been keeping at arm's length because feeling it meant being vulnerable to losing it, and losing things had cost her so much already. But she let herself feel it now, at least a little. The beginning of something permanent. They talked through what to do about Cole. David wanted to refuse the demand outright, which Nora thought was correct, but she also thought the refusal needed to be done in a way that made clear that Cole's leverage was illusory. She had, she pointed out, a certain amount of practical experience with men who used information as a weapon. She had thought about it in the years of her marriage, all the things Carter had known about her that she had not wanted revealed, and she had eventually understood that the power of that kind of secret was in the keeping, not the telling. Once a secret was out, voluntarily and on your own terms, it could no longer be used as a weapon against you. David submitted a letter to the army himself. It was Nora's suggestion, and it was the kind of suggestion that required significant courage to act on. He wrote to the regional commander of the U.S. Army and provided a full account of his own actions during the period in question, including his eventual refusal of orders, his reasons, and the names of the civilian contractors, Raymond Cole among them, who had been present and who had profited. He sent it through the post office on a Wednesday morning and told Nora he had done it, and she looked at his face and she saw that he was afraid, which was the first time she had seen genuine fear in him, and it made her love him a little more, because only honest people felt afraid of telling the truth. When Cole was informed, through channels that moved fast in a small town, that David had written to the army, his position changed entirely. The leverage he had depended on evaporated, because you could not threaten a man with exposure when he had already exposed himself. And his own activities, which David's letter had outlined with considerable specificity, were now a matter of official record. He left redemption within 3 days. No confrontation, no dramatic exit. One morning he was gone, the hotel room empty, his horse no longer in the livery stable where David had boarded it, the debt for the week's stabling paid in cash left on the office desk. The threat of Cole left with him. But the relief that came after it was complicated by what David received in the weeks that followed. The Army's response arrived in late February. The letter was formal and careful, written in the language of official institutions managing difficult situations. David's account of the events was acknowledged. His eventual refusal was noted. The broader situation he had described was recorded. The letter did not absolve him of his earlier participation, because it could not honestly do that, and he would not have believed an absolution that came too easily. But it also confirmed that his subsequent actions and his voluntary disclosure were, in the Army's estimation, consistent with the conduct of a man who had made mistakes and then done everything in his power to address them. It was not a pardon. It was something more complicated and ultimately more real than a pardon. It was acknowledgement. He sat in the livery office and read the letter 3 times, and then he walked east to the edge of town and stood in the desert light for a while. And Nora, who had been watching from her doorway, gave him 30 minutes and then walked out to stand beside him. She did not say anything. She just stood there in the cold February light with her hands in her coat pockets, close enough that their arms were almost touching. After a while he said, "I don't feel cleaned." "No," she said. "That's not how it works. I thought maybe it would help more than it does." "It helps that you did it," she said. "The cleaning is slower than that. It takes longer than a letter." He turned to look at her. The desert was around them, pale and immense, the mountains far to the south a line of darker blue against the sky. He said, "You know something about carrying things." "I do," she said. He was quiet, and then he said Nora, which was the first time he had used her first name, and the sound of it in his voice was something she felt in her sternum. "Yes," she said. He said, "I want to ask you something, but I want to do it right. I don't want to press you." She turned to face him. The morning light was on his face and his dark eyes were on hers, and she could see, very clearly, the man he was and the man he had been trying to become, and the space between those two things that he was still navigating. She recognized the landscape of that navigation. She was in it herself. She said, "Ask me." "Are you willing to keep spending time with me?" he said, "with the understanding that what I want is something serious and permanent, and that I'm not going to push you toward it faster than you're able to go, but I also don't want to pretend I'm not thinking about it." She looked at him for a long moment. A hawk turned in the thermal above the desert, slow and certain. The wind moved through the mesquite. She thought about the soup on the step, 3 days running. She thought about the way he had walked away the third morning without waiting to see if she would open the door. She thought about telling him about Carter and watching him receive it without flinching and without using it. She said, "Yes, I'm willing." He exhaled slowly. Then he said, "Thank you." The courtship that followed was nothing like the one with Carter Voss. It was slower and less theatrical and considerably more real. It was built out of ordinary things. Walks along the desert road in the evening, conversations in the livery office over coffee that David brewed on the small iron stove he kept there, the Saturday community suppers that Nora now attended regularly, and that David attended too, sitting near but not with her, allowing the proximity to speak for itself. He came to her house for supper one evening in March, the first time a man had been inside her house since redemption, and she made the best meal she could manage on her limited resources, a rabbit she had traded Mrs. Calloway a Mendy dress for, roasted with the rosemary from David's garden potatoes, the dried apples from the community supper pantry. He ate with genuine appreciation and helped her clear without being asked, and they sat at her small table afterward with coffee and talked until it was late. And when he left he stood in her doorway and he said, "I had a very good evening." She said, "So did I," he said. "Next time I'll cook." She said, "Soup again." He smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, wide and genuine, and a little surprised by itself, as if he had not expected to smile and was pleased to find himself doing it. She discovered that she very much wanted to keep seeing that smile. "I could branch out," he said. "I'm not sure anything could be better than that soup," she said. He went home. She stood in the doorway for a moment after he was gone, feeling the cold air on her face and the warm remainder of the evening inside her, and she thought that this was what it was supposed to feel like. Not the consuming, overwhelming, slightly suffocating feeling she had confused for love with Carter, but this. The warmth that persisted after someone left. The wanting to see them again that was not desperate but was simply present. The ease of it, the way you could breathe around it. Spring came to redemption in the way of West Texas springs, which was not the gentle greening of a northern spring, but rather a sudden forceful warmth, the desert floor becoming vivid with the small wildflowers that only appeared for a brief window, Indian blanket and bluebonnet and the yellow burst of Mexican poppies. The light changed and the air changed, and the quality of the sky became something that could almost be called magnificent. In April, Carter Voss found her. It came first as a rumor, the way most bad news traveled in small towns. Someone knew someone who had spoken to a man in Pueblo who had described a man fitting Carter's description, asking questions about a woman traveling alone toward the Southern Territories. The rumor reached Nora through Mrs. Calloway, who told her with genuine concern, and the kind of tact that long experience with difficult news produced. "I thought you should know someone might be asking," she said. Nora thanked her and went home and sat at her kitchen table, and felt the familiar cold fear that she thought she had outrun settling back over her like a coat she had hoped to leave behind forever. She went to David. She told him that evening, simply and directly, that Carter might be looking for her. She told him that she was not certain and that she might be wrong, but that she had not survived this long by ignoring warnings. She told him that she was afraid, and she said that last part with a steadiness that she hoped concealed the depth of it, though she suspected it did not. David listened. When she was done, he said, "What do you want to do?" She had not expected that question. She had expected, perhaps, a plan already forming, a male readiness to take action and remove the problem. She had not expected to be asked what she wanted. "I want to not be afraid of him anymore," she said. "I want there to be a version of this where I don't have to keep running." "That version exists," he said. She looked at him. "How?" he said. "A woman who is alone can be pressured in ways that a woman who is not alone cannot be. That's just the truth of how things work in the world right now. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's true." He paused. "And there are legal remedies. Divorce, even here, is possible. It takes time and it requires you to file formally, but it can be done." She had known this in theory. She had been too afraid to think about it practically. "And while the process is happening," he said carefully, "if you were willing, I would like to be very clearly in your corner, publicly, in whatever way makes sense to you." She understood what he was offering. She understood the weight and the generosity of it. She said, "David, are you asking me to marry you?" he said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider letting me court you with that intention. The formal question I'll save for when the timing is right. I don't want to give you a proposal that's motivated by a threat." She looked at him for a long time. "That," she said, "is one of the kindest things anyone has ever said to me." He looked slightly embarrassed, which endeared him to her enormously. She said, "Court me then, formally, and we'll see about the rest." Carter Voss arrived in Redemption on the 5th of May, 1882. He rode in on a horse that was not as fine as the ones he used to keep, which told Nora something about the state of his finances. He was thinner than she remembered, and there were lines in his face that had not been there when she left, and none of these things made her feel sympathy, only the cold assessment of someone taking accurate inventory. He came to her house in the early afternoon, and he knocked on the door, and she opened it because she had known he was coming. David had gotten word that morning from the livery where Carter had stabled his horse, and she had prepared herself. Carter looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face that she could not read as easily as she once had, and then he said, "Nora, you're harder to find than I expected." "Good," she said. "I'd like to talk to you," he said. She said, "You can talk, I'll listen." "But I'm not inviting you inside." He talked. He talked about reconciliation, and about how things could be different, and about how he had changed. And she listened with the complete, composed attention of a woman who had spent years learning to hear the spaces between what was said and what was true. She heard a man who was not, in fact, particularly remorseful, but who was in some kind of financial difficulty, and who needed a legitimate, respectable wife, the way he had always needed one. She heard a man who had tried his options and found her more convenient than whoever else might be available. She said, "No." He said, "Nora," she said, "you should speak to the lawyer in this town, Mr. Aldridge. I'll be filing for divorce. I'd prefer if you cooperated with that process rather than contesting it." Carter's face changed. She had been afraid for years of what his face looked like when it changed like that, the shift from the smooth surface to what lived underneath. He said, "You can't divorce me, not without my agreement. You know how these things work." David Wilcox stepped around the corner of the house. He had been there since before Carter arrived, because they had planned it together. Nora's choice to face Carter herself and David's insistence on being physically present in case that changed. He walked to the small wooden gate of Nora's yard and put his hand on the post and stood there in the afternoon light, and he did not say anything threatening, and he did not put his hand on the revolver at his hip. He simply stood there, steady and clear, and looked at Carter Voss with the flat, patient attention of a man who had once faced things considerably more dangerous than this and was not impressed. Carter looked at David. He looked back at Nora. He said, "Who is this?" Nora said, "Someone who is in my corner." The calculation in Carter's eyes was visible and not subtle. He was assessing his position, and his position was not strong. He was in an unfamiliar town. He was underfunded, and he had arrived expecting to find a frightened, isolated woman, and had found instead a woman standing in her own doorway with a steady man at her gate and the complete, obvious absence of fear in her face. Nora said, "I want the divorce, Carter. I want it done properly and legally and without a long contest. If you cooperate, it goes faster and cleaner for both of us. If you don't, I will file regardless, and I will tell the truth in that filing about every single thing you did, every single thing." The silence after that was significant. Carter Voss, who had operated his entire adult life on the assumption that women who feared him could be controlled, found himself looking at a woman who did not fear him anymore. She had rebuilt herself in a desert town where he had no connections, no leverage, and no audience. She had told her truth to the one person whose opinion of her mattered, and he had not turned away. She was standing in her doorway in the May morning sun with her chin up and her voice completely level, and she was not going to move. He said, "Fine, just that." He turned and walked away, and he went back to the livery stable, and he retrieved his horse, and he left Redemption that afternoon. He had not agreed to cooperate with the divorce yet, but he had left, which was the most important thing. The divorce took 4 months. It was processed through the district court, documented by Mr. Aldridge the attorney, and Carter, when served with the formal papers, did ultimately sign them rather than fight a process that would have required him to travel to Texas and explain himself under oath. Nora suspected his current circumstances made the legal battle more trouble than the outcome was worth to him, and she did not care about his reasons. Only the result. The papers were finalized in September of 1882. On the evening that Nora received the final copy of the decree, she sat at her kitchen table with it in her hands, and she felt something give way inside her that had been braced and rigid for years. Not a collapse, not a breakdown, but the specific and physical sensation of something that has been held under extraordinary tension finally being allowed to release. She breathed. She cried a little, quietly. Then she put on her coat and walked to the livery stable. David was there, as he usually was in the evenings, doing the final checks on the horses before locking up. She walked in and handed him the decree without saying anything. He read it. He looked up at her. He said, "How do you feel?" She said, "Like I can breathe all the way down." He set the document carefully on the office desk, and he crossed the stable to where she was standing, and he took her hands in both of his. His hands were warm and were cruffined and completely steady. He said, "Nora Bell, I've been waiting to do this properly." She said, "I know you have." He said, "I love you. I've known it since January, since you walked in here and asked me straight about Raymond Cole, and stood there in that doorway like someone who was frightened and was going to be here anyway. I love you, and I want to spend my life with you, and I know what that means given everything we've both carried, and I'm asking anyway. I'm asking you to marry me." The tears came again, but they were a different kind. She looked at him, at his steady dark eyes and the honesty in his face and the hands holding hers, and she thought about soup on a cold step and a man who walked away without waiting. She thought about a man who asked what she wanted before deciding what to do. She thought about 4 minutes in the dark and $43 and the long road from Glenwood Springs to Redemption, Texas, and all the ways this moment was both impossible and completely real. She said, "Yes, David Wilcox, yes." They were married on the first Saturday of October, 1882, in the Redemption Church by the same minister who had watched them sit on opposite sides of his community suppers for 9 months. It was a small ceremony which suited both of them, attended by Mrs. Calloway, the Harpers, Sarah, whose daughter was now in the informal school lessons. Nora had recently started giving to 4 children in the town, and a handful of others who had become, without Nora quite noticing it happening, something like friends. David wore the good coat that Nora had discovered he owned but almost never wore, dark wool, well-maintained, and he had shaved with particular care, and he looked at her when she walked down the short aisle between the pews with an expression that she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. Pure, uncomplicated, radiant love. The kind that is not complicated by agenda or possession or fear. The kind that simply is. She wore the best dress she owned, which she had remade over the previous 2 weeks into something closer to what she wanted it to be. Blue, because she had always loved blue and had not been allowed to wear it for 4 years of her marriage to Carter because Carter did not like it. She wore it now. She said her vows in a steady voice. He said his in the same quiet, measured tone he used for everything, which meant they were absolutely sincere because that tone did not exist in him for performance. They were married. That night, which was the first night of everything being different, they sat together in what was now their house, having moved David's few belongings from the room behind the livery stable in a process that had taken 2 trips with a borrowed handcart. They sat at the table where she had sat alone for 7 months eating careful small meals, and they had supper together, which he had cooked, and they talked long into the evening about ordinary things, the winter preparation the livery needed, the children she was teaching, a book she had been reading, a plan he had for expanding the stable's capacity to take more boarded horses. Ordinary, daily, domestic things that were the most extraordinary things she had ever experienced. She thought about the woman she had been on the night she walked out of Glenwood Springs in the dark. That woman could not have imagined this evening. That woman was running, and the only horizon she could see was the next town, the next small survival, the continuation of breathing and existing under the radar of danger. That woman had not thought about love as something that could be safe. She had thought about it as something that was inherently a trap. She reached across the table and took David's hand. He turned it over and held hers, and they sat like that in the lamplight, and redemption was quiet around them. Over the following months, the shape of their life together took form in the small, detailed way that lives actually take form, not in great dramatic strokes, but in the accumulation of mornings and evenings and practical decisions and small kindnesses. David expanded the livery stable and took on a young hand, a Mexican boy named Tomás whose family had a small piece of land 3 miles east of town, and who was grateful for steady work, and whom David paid fairly and taught carefully. Nora continued her sewing and expanded her informal teaching, which was growing into something that the town's families were beginning to depend on, 4 children becoming 8, becoming 12. She wrote a letter to the county education board about establishing a formal school in Redemption. She received a response in March of 1883 that was encouraging. She sat across the dinner table from David that evening and read him the letter and watched his face as she read, the pride and pleasure in it, and she said, "I think they're going to say yes." He said, "Of course they are. Have you met you?" She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it and laughed, and the sound of his laughter filling their house was one of the things she had not known she had been waiting for. By the spring of 1883, she was pregnant. She knew it before she told him, that particular bodily knowledge that is different from everything else, and she waited until she was certain, which took several weeks of internal certainty warring with the old anxiety that certain knowledge was always followed by something that destabilized it. But the certainty persisted. She told him on a Tuesday evening, not dramatically, simply as a fact that was true and that she wanted to share. He sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "Nora." She said, "I know." He came around the table and he knelt beside her chair and he took her face in both his hands and looked at her with an expression that had no performance in it anywhere, pure undone love and wonder and something almost like reverence, and he said, "Are you well? Are you frightened?" She considered this honestly. "I'm well," she said, "and a little frightened, but mostly I'm happy." He pressed his forehead against hers. They stayed like that for a long moment. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a Thursday, during a windstorm that rattled the windows and sent the desert dust swirling through every gap in the walls. He was delivered by the town's only doctor, a capable older man named Carver, with Mrs. Calloway present and assisting, and David somewhere in the outer room working very hard at being calm and failing somewhat. When Carver opened the door and told him he had a son and that both mother and child were healthy, David went into the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Nora, who was exhausted and radiant in the way that only women in the immediate aftermath of birth are radiant, holding the baby against her chest. He sat there for a while without words, which was like him, and then he said, "He's perfect." She looked at the small face, the dark hair, the absolute compact perfection of a new person who had not existed before. "He really is," she said. They named him James after Nora's father, the schoolteacher who had given her books and a love of learning and had died leaving her the schoolhouse contract and exactly nothing else but somehow everything that mattered. James David Wilcox arrived in November of 1883 and immediately became the most important thing in redemption. The school opened in early 1884. Nora was, formally and officially, its teacher. She had fought for the position through 3 letters to the county board and 1 in-person meeting that required her to travel to the county seat and leave James with David and Mrs. Calloway, and spend 2 days making the argument that she was the most qualified person for the position, because she was the only person who had been doing it. The board had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, and had allocated funds for a proper school building. The building went up in the spring of 1884, a solid wooden structure with 4 windows and a proper chalkboard and 20 desks that David and Tomas and a crew of town men built over a series of weekends. On the morning it opened, Nora stood at the door and watched 14 children file in, ranging from 6 to 14 years old, their faces carrying that particular mix of excitement and wariness that children brought to new experiences, and she felt the full circle of it. She had started as a teacher in Colorado, in a leaking 1-room building, and that life had been taken from her. She had built a new one here, out of $43 and a 4-minute window and the courage of a long road, and it was better than the one before in every way that mattered. James was a fat, happy, opinionated baby who became a fat, happy, opinionated toddler with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw. He was walked through the livery stable on David's shoulders from the time he was old enough to be carried that way, and he developed a particular attachment to a gentle old mare named Blossom, and a corresponding complete absence of fear around horses that David watched with quiet pride. David had also, over the year since James's birth, done something that Nora had watched with great attention and considerable emotion. He had begun to find a way to address the injustices of his past, not just through the army letter, but through his actual present life. There was a Comanche family in the area, displaced and managing a difficult situation at the margins of several competing pressures, land claims and cattle operations, and the general erasure of traditional ways that the expansion of white settlement continued to enforce. David had connected with them, carefully and respectfully, through a chance encounter that had its roots in his army period and his knowledge of the region. He had not done this in any dramatic way. He had simply made himself available and fair and consistent, had employed 2 of the family's young men at the livery when they needed work, and paid them what he paid Tomas, had interceded on a property question that could have gone badly, and had instead been resolved with paper and process rather than violence. It did not undo the past. He had never claimed it would. But it was the texture of a life lived with accountability, and Nora loved him for it with a depth that continued to surprise her. In the summer of 1885, Nora discovered she was pregnant again. She told David on a Sunday morning, sitting in the kitchen with coffee and the particular morning light of the desert summer coming through the window, and he set down his cup and said, "How are you feeling about it?" She said, "Happy. Tired already in a way that I remember from last time, and happy." He smiled. That wide, slightly surprised smile that she never got entirely used to. "Two," he said. "Two," she confirmed. Their daughter was born in February of 1886. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, simply because it was the name that felt right when they looked at her. She arrived in the world with a full head of red hair that startled the doctor and delighted Nora, and sent David into a laughing fit that took several minutes to resolve, because there was no red hair anywhere in the history of either of their families that either of them knew of, which seemed entirely typical of Clara from the very first hours of her life. James was 2 years old and regarded his sister with the particular imperious suspicion of a small child whose world has been altered without his consent. But within a week, he had been completely won over by the way Clara looked at him, which was with the focused intensity of a person who had already decided he was interesting, and the two of them formed an alliance that would define the next decade of the Wilcox household. The school grew. By 1887, Nora had more students than she could adequately teach alone, and she wrote to the county board and also to a teacher training college in Austin, and eventually she had an assistant, a young woman just arrived in Redemption named Harriet, who was eager and quick, and whom Nora took under her wing with considerable pleasure. The livery stable became, under David's steady management, the most reliable operation in Redemption. He had expanded it twice, and had begun to board and train horses for some of the larger ranches in the area, a service that required skill and patience, and that he was exceptionally good at. He had also, in a move that Nora had encouraged and David had taken time to feel certain about, hired Tamaz on as a full partner rather than a hand. Tamaz's English had improved enormously over the 4 years they had worked together, and his skill with horses was beginning to exceed even David's in some areas, and the arrangement made Tamaz a man of standing in the town and made the business stronger. In the evenings, when James and Clara were in bed and the house was quiet, Nora and David sat together at the kitchen table where she had once eaten soup alone and thought carefully about whether to trust the man who had left it. Sometimes they read. Sometimes they talked about the day or the children or the school or the stable. Sometimes they simply sat with the kind of comfortable quiet that is only possible between two people who have been through the full range of what a relationship can contain and have come out the other side still choosing each other. She had told him once, in the 2nd year of their marriage, that she thought about the soup sometimes, that it was the thing she returned to when she needed to remember that kindness was real. He had looked at her with a slightly embarrassed expression and said that he had been worried it was overstepping, leaving food for a woman who had not asked for it. She had said that the not asking was the point, that he had left it and walked away, and that walking away was the most important part, the signal that he was giving something without attaching himself to the giving. He had considered this and said, "I just didn't want you to be cold." She had kissed him, and the simplicity of him, the uncomplicated, genuine quality of that explanation, had filled her so completely that she could not speak for a moment. In 1888, Redemption got its railroad stop. The town changed as towns changed when the railroad arrived. It grew. New people came. New businesses opened. The character of the place became busier and louder and more various, and some of what had been particular and specific about small-town Redemption was diluted by the arrival of the larger world. But the things that mattered stayed. The school, now a proper 2-room building with Nora and Harriet teaching 30 students. The livery stable, now a significant operation with Tamaz and 2 other employees. The friends who had accumulated slowly and without Nora quite planning it. Mrs. Calloway, who had become the closest thing Nora had to a mother. Sarah, whose daughter was now one of Nora's best students. A newer friendship with a woman named Esperanza, whose family had lived in the region for 3 generations, and who knew the land and the history of it in ways that enriched everything around her. James was 6 by 1889 and in school, in his mother's class, which created the particular dynamic of a child who knew his teacher's full range of expressions and used this knowledge to push exactly to the correct edge of acceptable behavior without crossing it. David said this demonstrated intelligence. Nora said it demonstrated a need for stronger rules. They were both right. Clara was 3 and already demonstrating that the focused intensity with which she had regarded her brother as a newborn was her essential character. She focused intensely on everything. The horses in the stable, the embroidery that Nora still did in the evenings, the book she had decided she was going to learn to read, regardless of the fact that she was 3. In the spring of 1890, on a particularly beautiful May morning, when the desert was still holding some of the color from its brief spring bloom, David and Nora walked east along the road out of town, the way they had walked 8 years before when he had told her about Raymond Cole and the army and the darkness of his past. They walked without urgency, the way two people walk when they are not going anywhere in particular, simply going together. James was at school. Clara was with Mrs. Calloway, who adored her with a grandmother's completeness. The desert was pale and vast and quietly magnificent around them. The mountains in the south were clearer than usual, the air washed by recent rain. David said, "I've been thinking about something," she said. "That happens to you sometimes." He looked sideways at her. She was, he thought, more beautiful than she had been when she arrived in Redemption, though beautiful was not exactly the right word. She was more herself. The wariness was not entirely gone, because it had been too thoroughly written into her to vanish completely, but it lived differently in her now. It lived as watchfulness rather than fear, as competence rather than survival. She wore her dark hair looser than she used to, and she had laugh lines at the corners of her eyes, and she looked like a woman who had built something and was standing in the middle of it. He said, "I've been thinking that I'm grateful," she said. "For what specifically?" He said for the third morning. She stopped walking, he stopped with her. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with that expression she knew as well as any landscape now, the one that was all of him in it, the weight and the history and the dark past and the steady quiet love, all of it present at once and not hidden from her. She said, "I was thinking about the third morning too, just now." He said, "What were you thinking?" she said. "That I almost didn't open the door. That I stood there for a full minute holding the pot with the door still almost closed, and I was so close to stepping back inside and not opening it any further." She paused, "And I thought about what it would have meant if I had. What I would have done without the thing I have now." He said, "What made you open it the rest of the way?" She thought about it honestly. She said, "The soup was warm. You had walked all the way to my house in the January cold and left me warm soup and asked nothing. And I thought that if I closed the door on that, I was closing the door on the possibility that the world still had things like that in it. And I couldn't close the door on that. Not completely." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad you couldn't," she said. "So am I." They stood together in the desert morning light, and Redemption sat behind them, small and particular against the immense landscape. Its church and its school and its livery stable, and the adobe house on the eastern edge, where a woman had once eaten soup alone and cried at the simple fact of being thought of. She had come here with $43 and a bruised jaw and a name she was reclaiming, and she had built a life here that was richer and more various and more thoroughly loved than anything she had imagined in the dark of Glenwood Springs. She took David's hand and they walked further east, into the desert morning, the sun warm on their faces and the wide world opening around them. Two people who had survived difficult things and chosen, every morning since a particular morning in January 1882, to walk toward each other rather than away. The hawk was turning above the desert again, high and unhurried, its circles patient and wide. On the step of the adobe house on the eastern edge of Redemption, Texas, there was no longer a pot of soup. There was instead a child's boot left outside to dry, and a pot of rosemary growing in a clay container, and 2 rocking chairs side by side that faced east toward the desert morning. The door was open. It had been open for years, and the woman who had once pressed herself against the inside wall, heart hammering, listening to boots on her step, now stood in the wide desert with her husband's hand in hers and the whole long remainder of her good life ahead of her, and she was not afraid. She was home.